The members of COINTELPRO, by the way, who did these illegal things, could have gone to jail for 10 years for the illegal actions, but instead they were fined a few $1,000s, and then Reagan pardoned them, so they didn't even pay the fines. So that's cool. So, meanwhile, the Weather Underground was falling apart. There was a lot of division. A lot of other leftists had different opinions on the Weatherman. A lot of them were really coming to criticize them for committing to violence and militancy, and then switching over to what was deemed armed propaganda. They still continued to plot on the Weather Underground, but in 1977, they found out their organization had been infiltrated by undercover FBI agents, so their next plot was basically foiled by that. And by 1979, most of the members of the Weather Underground turned themselves in, took advantage of the fact they were let off the hook, and the amnesty for draft dodgers from Jimmy Carter. Now, Ayers and Dorn, who were two of the founding members, William Ayers being that awesome terrorist that Obama pals around with, had some kids at this point, and they turned themselves in 1980, basically got off scotch-free, got probation and a fine, and though other members at that point went on to join other revolutionary groups for whatever actions, they were no longer the Weather Underground. The turning in of Ayers and Dorn turned themselves in. That was basically the end of what the Weather Underground was. Now, members of the Weather Underground have looked back on what they did with extremely mixed feelings. Some of them regret it completely, have said basically they thought they had the moral high road and they were justifying things that were absolutely terrible, and they only narrowly dodged mass murder, etc., etc. Whereas others said very specifically, I'd do it again. If I were back in that position, I would do it again. Now, William Ayers said, we did carry out symbolic acts of extreme vandalism directed at monuments to war and racism, and the attacks on property, never on people, were meant to respect human life and convey outrage and determination to end the Vietnam War, the responsibility for the risks we posed to others in some of our more extreme actions in those underground years never leaves my thoughts for long. The anti-war movement, in all its commitment, all its sacrifice and determination, could not stop the violence unleashed against Vietnam, and therein lies the cause for real regret. Now, I think the most interesting guy, how he's turned, is this guy Mark Rudd, who's again one of the founding members, and he said, there were things I'm not proud of, and I find it hard to speak publicly about them and to tease out what was right from what was wrong. I think part of what the Weatherman phenomenon was right in was our understanding of what the position of the United States was and is in the world. It was this knowledge that we just couldn't handle. It was too big. We didn't know what to do. In a way, I still don't know what to do with that knowledge. I don't know what needs to be done now, and it's still eating away at me 30 years, just like it did 30 years ago. Now, whatever their feelings about it now, there are some things definitely to look at with the Weather Underground and really examine. They've kind of come under a lot of hot criticism from one direction or another for their actions, but whatever we criticize, a few things remain really evident to me. One, they didn't really accomplish what they meant to accomplish. They weren't even just an anti-war organization. They meant to topple the U.S. government. They didn't get revolutionary support. They didn't become central to a large set of other revolutionary organizations. They didn't overthrow the U.S. government that I've heard of. Now, the reasons for this are many, but a lot of it is that even though much of the counterculture sympathized, very few were willing to join the ranks. And even with the person protecting violence, Mark Rudd, this member, said that he believed that Americans are taught that all violence not sanctioned by the U.S. government is either criminal or mentally ill, and he blames the mentality that caused the lack of support on this factor. Now, Mark Rudd also commented at the reason he feels he participated in revolutionary violence, as he is now anti-violence, while so many others in the movement did not, was his grief leading to outrage and then to violence in response to the U.S.'s actions. And Mark Rudd has made statements implying that his path is now nonviolent revolution, having experienced the lack of effectiveness of revolutionary violence. And he's quoted a lot in another book called The Unconquerable World. Now, there are a lot of critics of that stance, though, saying that it's nothing to do with the fact that they were trying to be violent that ended up making them ineffective, because they said it wasn't the lack of revolutionary potential, it wasn't the way American people approach things. It was because the Weather Underground had no strategy, no perspective, and many say a lack of commitment. Now, they made a lot of claims, we're going to overthrow the U.S. government, and then they kind of said, well, we're going to allow other people to overthrow the U.S. government, we're going to damage them materially, we're going to try and cripple them materially. But what they really did, even in all these bombings, these 5 or 6 a year bombings, was cause a few million in damages by today's standards. So nothing significant enough to really cripple the U.S. in a military way. And basically what they did turned into something symbolic and ineffective, as far as what it actually came down to. They relied on other people to come in and do the real damage while they provided a symbolic platform of launch, which they hoped would inspire other people to follow suit, to do damage themselves, and that it would spread like wildfire. The Prairie Fire Organization, that actually comes from a quote by Mao, saying that a single spark can light the prairie on fire. But it didn't happen due to various reasons. And again, a lot of people argue over that. A lot of the people who are opposed to them, as far as saying, it wasn't because you weren't violent, it was possibly because you weren't violent enough, and also you were stupid and ineffective and had no strategy. They basically said, a lot of these other groups said, the SDS was hijacked by the weathermen, who took it a step backwards, and they were really freaked out. They had this sense of urgency and this high morality, and we need to do something, we need to effect change right now. And they changed the SDS from this large organizational group that was growing and was pretty effective in a lot of ways, and they changed it into a disorganized kind of pell-mell of people bombing things without a real strategy of where that was going to go. There's the split about it from people that say that they feel that they were too violent and that the increase in violence was a poor example of the anti-war movement and that it was antagonizing the American people. But again, the split has both sides, and I would tend to say that certainly the violence to me is kind of a neutral factor. Whether or not being violent to people would have helped or hurt, I think that it would have antagonized people further, but they were bombing 6 buildings a year. They didn't have a structure, they didn't have a plan, and I think that's pretty clearly where they lost momentum and lost steam in the project. If you want other perspectives on all this stuff, other information, William Ayres published a book called Fugitive Days, where he talks about his time from about 1970 to 1980 with the Weather Underground. There's a documentary which you can find totally on YouTube. It's an hour and a half. It's called The Weather Underground. It's actually shockingly well balanced. It's got a lot of people who were very anti-Weather Underground. It's also got people who say, what we did was right, what they were doing was right. And there are a few of the books: Underground, My Life with the Weathermen, which was by Dave Rudd, Bringing the War Home, The Way the Wind Blew, Now Laws of America, all pretty solid pieces on the Weather Underground, which is what I have for you tonight. I didn't take too long with that. It's decent.
We're running late, but I think it's actually, you were like, hey, maybe they thought themselves as following a proper Marxist-Leninist line. And I almost want to refute that, and to do that, I'm actually just going to go to Lenin.
Okay.
This isn't what is to be done, and he's making this distinction where essentially there's economists who are like, hey, if we find out what the people want and get behind that. And then there's the people who are actually advocating for terrorism. And so I'll just quote at length. Spadova, which is the people advocating for terror, the newspaper, advocates terror as a means of exciting the labor movement and of giving it a strong impetus. It is difficult to imagine an argument that disproves itself more than this one does. Are there not enough outrages committed in Russian life that a special stimulant has to be invented? On the other hand, it is not obvious that those who are not and cannot be roused by excitement, even by Russian tyranny, will stand by twiddling their thumbs even while a handful of terrorists are engaged in a single combat with the government. Spadova desires to substitute terror for agitation, openly admitting that as soon as intensified and strenuous agitation is commenced among the masses, its excitative function will be finished. But ostensibly what we have is, hey, the middle class, they just don't care, they're self-interested, so we're going to shock them. We're going to do these symbolic acts, and we're going to declare them as a solidarity statement, and eventually they'll get with the program by realizing, hey, they're doing this, this is happening, it's drawing attention to these heinous crimes. But yeah, I don't see that as necessarily something that it should be pursued. So that's just my...
They certainly believed they were Marxist-Leninists.
Not good ones, I would say. But